If the world were like a Sleep Number mattress, everything would adapt for your comfort. Because as your life changes and your body changes, Sleep Number mattresses adapt and shift to give you personalized comfort night after night. And now everything's on sale during our Memorial Day event. Save up to $1,200 on mattresses, plus free delivery when you add a base. Ends Monday. To experience a whole new world of comfort, visit a Sleep Number store or go to sleepnumber.com. Sleep Number, to a good life sleep.
Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and in this episode, I am bringing you an interview. Before I go right to it, I have one spoiler warning for you. If you have not yet read Murder on the Orient Express, be warned that that title will be spoiled in this conversation, which I am very excited to go to right now. In nearly 10 years of the All About Agatha podcast, my late partner and co-host, Catherine Brobeck, and I have had all sorts of different authors on the show who have written all sorts of different books inspired by or invoking Agatha Christie in some way. But today, I think we have one of the most unusual instances of a Christie-inspired work of scholarship. Amy Littlefield has reported on abortion rights for more than a decade. She is the abortion access correspondent for The Nation. She has contributed to the New York Times opinion section and is a frequent commentator on abortion for various TV and radio news outlets and podcasts. So this is not the sort of bio you're used to hearing from me as I begin an interview, but here is where I will add that Amy is, and I'm quoting now from her email to me, a murder mystery fangirl who has thoroughly enjoyed All About Agatha over the years. And recently, she came out with her first book, titled Killers of Roe, My Investigation into the Mysterious Death of Abortion Rights. Believe it or not, listeners, the one word she uses to describe this book, which delves into the incredibly complex sociopolitical history of abortion rights, or lack thereof, in the United States, is whodunit. In her book, Amy channels her and my favorite amateur sleuth, Miss Marple, as she investigates who is to blame for the death of abortion rights in this country and how. And I don't want you to think that this is merely a marketing ploy. Miss Marple and Monsieur Poirot and Agatha Christie herself are thoroughly referenced throughout this text. Each chapter begins with a relevant quote from a Christie mystery, and Amy, who narrates the book in the first person, is constantly bringing up Miss Marple and lots of Christie tropes as she interviews witnesses, weighs evidence, considers motive, means, and opportunity, and assigns guilt to varying degrees for all sorts of people and organizations who come into play in this long and checkered history here in the United States. Finally, and this is the end of my intro, I'm almost done. Before we get properly started, I want to state the obvious, which is that unusually for this podcast, this episode is going to be a political one. Generally, I steer clear of politics, or at least the outright discussion of politics, since I know many listeners come to this podcast for a respite from such matters. But politics is embedded in everything that we do. So to my mind, it's inevitable that every now and then we are going to veer into an outright political conversation here on this podcast even. Some of you may decide this is not the episode for you. That is your right. Of course it is. If so, I look forward to seeing you on the next episode, but I'm more than willing to risk the discomfort and displeasure of some of you for a discussion of a book that makes such an interesting and unusual use of Christie's work and which deals with such an important topic, one that was near and dear to Catherine Brobeck's heart. This is another reason I was so eager to speak with Amy. Catherine worked in women's reproductive health, and while she passed away before the reversal of Roe versus Wade in 2022, I know for a fact how horror-struck she would have been by it. Not necessarily surprised, but horror-struck, and how hard she would have fought in its wake. There is no question in my mind that Catherine would have jumped at the opportunity to have Amy on our show to discuss this issue by way of Agatha Christie, but I also want to be clear that I am jumping at this opportunity, not just for Catherine, but for myself. I, too, am horrified by the sorry state of women's access to reproductive health services in this country. And I think the conversation in Amy's book is a crucial one that more people need to be having right now, if that sorry state of affairs is going to be reversed or ameliorated in any significant way. So, for lots of different reasons, I would now like to say, welcome to the podcast, Amy. I'm so glad you're here.
Kemper, thank you so much for having me on the podcast and for that beautiful introduction. I'm so honored to be here, especially because I have listened so diligently to your podcast, to you and Catherine, over the years. I would go on long walks while doing research for this book, listening to all about Agatha, learning about the many dimensions of Miss Marple, and I'm just so grateful to be here with you.
All right. We have a lot of ground to cover, but I would like to start, as I so often do in my interviews here on this podcast, with your Agatha Christie origin story. So when and how did you first discover Agatha Christie, and what did she come to mean to you?
So I first read Agatha Christie in middle school, and I can remember perfectly going to the school library at my middle school, checking out a copy of Death on the Nile. And at the time, we were doing this like reading buddy program where you were supposed to read a book and then write to a classmate about what you were reading in the book. And I can remember being totally engrossed in Death on the Nile and writing in my letter to my classmate, I think that this guy, Hercule Poirot, did it. Like, he's super shady. He's just like acting really weird. He's got like this mustache. He's like going around like nosing into everyone's business. Like, I think it's him. And my book buddy, who like obviously was more familiar with Agatha Christie than I was at the time, was like, actually, like Hercule Poirot is kind of like a central recurring character in Agatha Christie's canon. Like, I really don't think he did it. Like, I think you're on the wrong track. So, you know, obviously the greatest pleasure in an Agatha Christie is when you don't see it coming. And so I was totally hoodwinked by her and completely hooked on her after that. I still have my like dog-eared paperbacks from middle and high school that I would read. And really, I think as with so many of your listeners, like Agatha Christie for me was comfort. It was an escape, especially during adolescence when there's a lot that's outside of one's control. I would sit and read these books, and I would watch like my VHS tape of Murder on the Orient Express with Albert Finney, which was like this, I think it was like a 2 VHS tape set, you know? And I had one friend who was as into Agatha Christie as I was. She would come over and we'd watch it together. And, you know, I never could guess the ending, but I always knew that it was going to come out okay in the end. And then I returned to it in new motherhood. You know, more recently, when I became a mom during the pandemic, it became my comfort and my escape once again.
That's so great. Yeah. And I think that's a common story. People who discovered Christie first in childhood and then who return to her and get something similar to what they got out of her when they were a child, but also a little bit different, a little enhanced, right? As your sort of experience of life becomes more complex, maybe what you need to get out of your comfort reading becomes a little bit more complex as well, or just a little bit different. So then Death on the Nile was the first one?
That was my first, yes.
Oh, wow. I mean,
yes.
What a great way to begin. Do you have, yeah, I mean, it's just, you know, the great thing though about Christie is like, it's not downhill from there. It's just that you started in a good place and you had a lot of other good places to go, but that's one of the very best. Do you have a favorite Agatha Christie book?
Okay, so I thought long and hard about this, Kemper, and I studied your rankings. And as you know, I've listened to you and Catherine discuss these books in great detail. I feel like the choice that I've made here is respectable. It's not the top of your list, but it is a Marple, so I think you'll appreciate that. My favorite is The Body in the Library. Mm-hmm. I just think the opening scene is perfection. The Bantrys waking up in Gossington Hall and like it's a normal, beautiful day. And then there's like a body in the library. And it's like, oh my gosh. And it's just such a good opener. It's so sort of almost humorous and tongue in cheek, the way that Christie constructed it. And then I just love the friendship between Dolly Bantry and Miss Marple. Dolly is just such a girl's girl. She's like constantly like gassing up Miss Marple. She's like, come on, Jane, like you're so brilliant. Like, haven't you solved it yet? And every time she introduces, her friend Miss Marple, she's like, she's just so brilliant. She always solves everything, And like Arthur is just like out looking at the pigs, feeling morose. And like women are just driving all the action in this novel, right? And I love the detail that like part of the way Miss Marple solves the case is by talking with this young girl, right? Who's friends with the missing girl guide. And by sort of understanding this young girl has something she's not telling, and she sort of teases it out of her because like that's Miss Marple's superpower, right? She can gain trust and listen to people who the male authorities in these books might just totally disregard or not take seriously. So yeah, I love that book. If I could spend a few minutes in any setting of any of these books, I would totally like pal around with Dolly Bantry and Miss Marple while they're like trying to crack this case.
That is a great answer. I actually have on my long list of potential episode ideas, and this is coming from a listener, so it wasn't even my idea to begin with, but I would like to rank the books by opening, because there are so many Christies that are ranked high, but not the highest necessarily, that have some of the very best openings. And that's probably the number one example where like the opening to The Body in the Library is one of the very, very, very best. And then looking at, what is the differential between the book opener and then how the book overall is ranked within our general grid, because I think that would be really interesting. Which books maybe have a slightly weaker opening, but then the book sort of grows from there. I mean, Christie is known for her fantastic opening hooks. And I'd say even, usually she just grabs you in that first chapter, but like it's one of the very best examples. So I love that answer. And I often tell people to start with The Body in the Library. Like, I think it's the best Miss Marple to start with because it's so short, but also devious. I think the book captures Christie at her kind of devious best, but with that efficiency that she's known for, where you're like, how did you manage to pull this off within basically 200 pages? That you completely tricked me and I never saw it coming, but it's so simple, it's so elegant, and yeah. Anyway.
It's so good. And the like contrast between the world of like Basil Blake and this whole like hip, like Hollywood kind of world. And then like it just makes Gossington Hall that much more like pastoral and perfect, right? By contrast.
Yes, there's so much going on. The St. Mary Mead, the Dane myth, like there's a lot. There's a lot going on there. Well, speaking of a lot going on, I know that you have done years worth of journalistic work concerning the right to abortion here in the United States. And that, that has never stopped being what we could call a hot button issue. I think within recent years, certainly since the overturning of Roe versus Wade, which at this point now is almost 4 years ago, I think it's been an even hotter button issue. But in that a journalist investigates from the outside in, I don't think it's really a huge leap to imagine a journalist being a sort of sleuth, which is exactly what you're doing here in this book. And I'm just curious, and this is, my sneaky way of beginning to discuss what you're doing in this book. I'm wondering if you ever thought of yourself that way before you even started this book, as a Christie fan and as someone who was doing this sort of journalistic investigating.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I began to think of myself that way about 5 years ago when it became clear to me that Roe v. Wade was going to fall and that we were going to lose the almost 50-year-old constitutional right to abortion. I'd been reporting on the incremental death of abortion rights for many years, but once it became clear to me that the end game had arrived, that the anti-abortion movement was going to succeed in overturning Roe at last, it felt like a sort of death, right? There was a death of this human right that I had taken for granted, that I think many in my generation had almost taken for granted for my whole life. And so I set about trying to do a postmortem. I started interviewing all the witnesses, and I started actually with people in the pro-choice movement. I started talking to former leaders of some of the top reproductive rights groups. I started talking to lawyers and advocates and anyone I could reach to ask them sort of what went wrong And what were the motives, the means, the opportunities here that went into the death of this human right? And that initially was for a piece that came out in the New York Times that was titled "What Went Wrong," that looked at mistakes within the abortion rights movement among, the folks that I happen to agree with, and what they could reflect on about what had gone wrong. And then, in the wake of the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe, I turned that lens on the anti-abortion folks as well.
If the world were like a Sleep Number mattress, everything would adapt for your comfort. Because as your life changes and your body changes, Sleep Number mattresses adapt and shift to give you personalized comfort night after night. And now everything's on sale during our Memorial Day event. Save up to $1,200 on mattresses, plus free delivery when you add a base. Ends Monday. To experience a whole new world of comfort, visit a Sleep Number store or go to sleepnumber.com. Sleep Number. To a good life sleep.
And when you decided to write a book about this, how did you make the decision to frame that book as a literal Miss Marple-ish investigation into a quote-unquote murder mystery? Like, it's such an interesting and unusual way to frame a book on this topic. I'm curious how you sold this to your editor, or maybe, just like, did you come to this together? Like, how did you come to write this very, very unusual book?
Yeah, it was not the book that I originally pitched to my editor. The book that I originally pitched was a more sort of traditional nonfiction history. And my editor really encouraged me to write in the first person. And then we arrived at the murder mystery, at the time. So when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, I was a new mom, right? And it was the height of the pandemic. So I gave birth in April 2020, which was like the height of, it was like COVID. Yeah. I had to wear a surgical mask, like when I started pushing, like it was like this wild, scary time. And I had a newborn. And the only content I could really consume was Agatha Christie. I was listening to Agatha Christie novels on my AirPods while I was breastfeeding this like tiny vulnerable infant child in the middle of the night. And so I had returned to this like place of escapism for my adolescence and was like rediscovering Christie all over again. And I knew when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died what was going to happen, right? I knew that we were going to lose Roe v. Wade, and I knew women were going to die preventable deaths as a result. And I knew that because I had spent almost a decade at that point digging into this history already, I really wanted to tell the story in full and to look into how we got here. And I knew it was going to be hard, right? I knew I was going to have to dig into these tragic and totally preventable deaths. I knew I was going to have to spend time with a lot of anti-abortion men. I knew I was going to have to be around some pretty unpleasant characters, to borrow a phrase from Christie. Mm-hmm. And so it started as a way to sort of draw myself into the reporting and entice myself to tell the story, and to use this kind of comforting paradigm as a way to tell a really tough story. And I hope it will also draw the reader into the story as well. I think right now is a pretty tough time for people of conscience to interact with reality, and to interact with the history that got us here. And so if I can sort of make that a little more readable, a little easier to do using this paradigm that I think is comforting to so many of us, but that is especially comforting to women, right? I think like true crime and murder mystery are really appealing to us. And so it started as a hook for me. And then I hope it's also a hook for the reader.
I think that's such a good point that it is comforting to so many women. And Catherine and I have talked about that. Is it a coincidence that the co-hosts of All About Agatha are a woman and a gay man? And, you start meeting people within the fandom of Golden Age detective fiction and those two categories, you will come across them time and time again. Not that there are only women and gay men who are fans of murder mysteries. That's not at all what I'm saying. But I think that sometimes, it's the idea of people who exist a little bit on the margins or who might not feel empowered, who particularly enjoy the agency that comes with reading a genre of fiction that allows you to put yourself in the driver's seat if you want to, should you choose to. It's really just about the choice, because I think there are so many people who end up reading murder mysteries passively, as I do. Catherine did not. Catherine read them very actively and was always trying to solve them ahead of, or at least neck and neck with, the fictional detectives. But just having that option, I think, provides so much satisfaction in a meaningful way to certain groups of people. And it is also, I think, crucial that your book is narrated from the first person, because you can feel that. You can feel your sort of comfort and the agency that I think you derive from at least being able to make sense of this within a paradigm that you clearly love. And that's why I wanted to be clear in that, in my intro, that you really do bring up the murder mystery tropes and just sort of the framing of a murder mystery and what would Miss Marple do and how are these Agatha Christie's structured all over the place. I mean, it's every couple of pages, and it really helps. I mean, it certainly helped me. I'm obviously a fan of the genre because there's so many details. There's so much complexity here. This is a truly granular examination of a decades-long process that involves not just 7 suspects, but really, hundreds of people, which you are distilling into something that we're able to make sense of as we're reading the book. But there's just a lot of complexity there. And I think it absolutely does help. I mean, when I was sitting down after having read the book and thinking about how we were going to talk about it, I thought that it's really interesting that you are referencing murders in Agatha Christie books, which are, of course, murders of real flesh and blood people. And yet, the big murder here in your book, I mean, it's right there in your title, Killers of Roe. What you're really covering is the murder or the death of a legal right, the death of a constitutional right, the death of a movement. But then, to make matters even more complicated, given that your topic is abortion, there are actual human deaths on both sides of this issue, which you've already referred to. For instance, you can go back, you, in fact, in your book, go back time and again to the case of Rosie Jimenez, who died from an infection due to an unsafe abortion procedure in 1977. She procured that as a direct result of restrictions placed on abortion rights in 1976. This was the so-called Hyde Amendment, which many listeners might know, and which you explore very, very deeply in the book. So one could say that Rosie Jimenez was murdered by anti-abortion forces who pushed through that amendment and then changed other laws and public policies in lots of smaller, less obvious ways. All of this is examined in detail in your book. But then, the anti-abortion movement, of course, uses murder to describe abortion itself. According to them, abortion is murder. It's the murder of countless humans each and every day. So the word murder, the concept of murder, is an incredibly loaded and complicated one in your book, much more so than I think in your garden variety murder mystery. So I just love if you could talk about how you negotiated all of that as you were writing your book, because I'm sure that the complexity of this came up.
Yes. I mean, I knew I was taking a risk by writing a book about abortion that used the framework of a murder mystery, right? Because we're so used to hearing opponents of abortion describe people who promote or even the people who have abortions sometimes as murderers, right? I used to work at a clinic many years ago, and I can remember being called a murderer on my way into work, right? And so I really kind of tried to lean into that complexity, and I kind of enjoyed flipping the script and saying, wait a minute, what about the women like Rosie who have died as a result of these policies? Were those women murdered? Can we consider that murder? And if so, how and why? And I wanted to understand the suspects, and I wanted to understand the victims as well. So, Rosie was a real person. She was a 27-year-old mom living in McAllen, Texas. She had had 2 previous abortions that were covered under Texas Medicaid, which is the health plan for low-income folks. And after the Hyde Amendment passed, she couldn't get another abortion covered in 1977. And so what should she do? She went to a lay midwife, an unsafe provider, who inserted a tube into her cervix. Rosie got a horrific infection, died an agonizing and terrible death as a result, left behind a 4-year-old daughter. Is that murder by public policy? And then when, even pro-choice activists and Democrats allow the policy that resulted in Rosie Jimenez's death to stand, I mean, it endures to this day, right? The Hyde Amendment has been renewed by every Congress every year, Republican or Democrat. Is that another kind of death? Can we consider that a second death? And so, I look at Rosie, but I also look at the more recent examples, that have come out in some of the reporting by ProPublica. Portia Gamese, a 35-year-old woman in Texas who left behind her children because she didn't get prompt treatment for a miscarriage, and her son chases after women who look like her on the street shouting, "That's mommy." Was she murdered? Or what do we call it when someone is killed by a public policy, and when that public policy is then allowed to stand? So I realize it's a provocative thing to use that terminology. And I was talking about, the death of a human right, but I'm also, I hope, raising important questions about what it means when people die as a direct result of policies that, many of our leaders in this country have agreed on.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really meaningful that you are using, death figuratively when you're talking about the death of a movement or, the death of a right, but then you really do use it literally, both to advance your own arguments and also to acknowledge the other side. And that's something that I want to talk about in a second, which is the fact that even though this book clearly has a stance, and the stance is that the loss of women's reproductive freedoms is detrimental and needs to be rectified, you speak with many people who vehemently oppose you and completely disagree with that stance and who are very anti-abortion, and you consider their opinions, and there's not necessarily a demonization of those individuals that's happening, which I really, really appreciated. And I think in that they use, as you said, the terminology of murder, saying that people are being murdered as a result of abortion. I think it was really effective, and not something that I think the pro-choice movement potentially does enough to say, well, we can go there too, and there are people whose lives are, ending as a result of these policies. Don't touch that dial. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of our episode. We just wanted to take a moment to ask you, our dear listeners, for a favor.
If you haven't already done so, we would very much appreciate it if you take a moment to, give us a rating or a review wherever you're listening to this podcast.
It really helps the podcast out because ratings and reviews make it much easier for other Christie fans such as yourselves to find our podcast.
And the more ratings and reviews we get, the more people we can reach.
It should take you a matter of seconds, and lucky you, we're going to provide you with those seconds right now, so go to it.
Thank you so much. And now, back to our regularly scheduled programming.
What was really interesting to me was the way that you really did, whenever possible, sit down with people who disagreed with you and the people who you're identifying as the ones who are responsible for these deaths, both figurative and literal. You consider them as three-dimensional people. You really tried to connect with them on a human level. And this is where we can draw a parallel to Miss Marple, who was one of the very best listeners in the Christie canon. I always remember Miss Marple at the beginning of A Caribbean Mystery, who was the only one who was willing to listen to Major Palgrave when he blusters on and tells his boring old stories. She at least pretends to be paying attention to him, and she kind of sort of actually does pay attention because that ends up being a major way in which she is able to solve that mystery. But of course, so her listening is one of her superpowers. And I was probably most struck by your listening superpowers in your interactions with Paul Herring. And this is a man who wrote an early draft of what would become the Hyde Amendment, which you were just talking about. So we're introduced to him in your first chapter, which opens with this fabulous quote from The Mysterious Affair at Styles: "Every murderer is probably somebody's old friend." That's another really great way of getting at this complexity where people are concerned. You know, the good guys have some bad in them, the bad guys have some good. And, you know, you are clearly someone who's reading Christie deeply, because you do have to read her texts a little bit more deeply to glean that complexity. But as I have attested for many years now, I absolutely think that complexity is there. And there's just another part of your book where you're also referencing Christie, which I think conveys this point so well. As Miss Marple moves through her inquiries, knitting and eavesdropping and listening to all the suspects, she soon discovers that just about everyone has a motive. The characters all turn out to be flawed human beings harboring sinister secrets. The murder mystery is at its heart about revealing the complexity of human nature. I was like exclaiming as I was reading that, because, you know, you're preaching to the choir for me as a reader, but I really appreciated that sentiment. And I just love if you could talk a little bit about how important this notion of three-dimensionality and complexity on a character level was to you as you were doing your investigations and writing a book that is very much trying to make an argument and take a stand, even though it's incorporating these opposing points of view.
Thank you so much for asking the question, for seeing my channeling of Miss Marple in that way, in a way that only you could appreciate, Kemper. I mean, this is why I love Miss Marple, right? She gets to the truth not by, you know, looking at the footprints under a magnifying glass, not by, you know, checking out the weird angle of this object on the mantelpiece, right? No, she gets to the truth by looking at human nature, by listening to people, by hearing them tell their own stories. And she sees how human nature is often complicated and flawed. And, you know, my favorite version of Miss Marple, and I know Catherine would have talked about Dark Marple, right?
Yes.
My personal favorite version of Miss Marple is Miss Marple of the 13 Problems, right? Early Miss Marple, who says that so many people seem to me not to be either bad or good, but simply, you know, very silly. And so I tried to bring this sort of like lightheartedness to this very serious task, because I think in the best of Agatha Christie's work, right, we end up with some degree of empathy or understanding for the culprits. Not always, right? Like, I mean, my favorite, The Body in the Library, is maybe an exception. Like, sometimes the crime is so horrible that we don't feel any sort of empathy. But I think certainly Murder on the Orient Express, right? We sympathize with the murderers. And when it comes to politics, when it comes to abortion in particular, we're so used to thinking of good and evil, black and white, right and wrong. And that's just not how people are. It's not how people live their lives. It's not how people experience their day-to-day reality. It's not how most people who are seeking an abortion feel about what they're doing, right? And so I think that's why we read mystery novels, to see that other people's thoughts and feelings and inner life is just as complicated as our own. And Miss Marple gets that, and that's how she gets to the truth. So I really was sort of trying to sort of channel my inner, like, not just my let's listen to these people and understand why they did what they did and how they did what they did, but like, what's complicated and counterintuitive about them, right? And I really loved finding these complex examples, you know, finding out, for example, that Henry Hyde, the conservative Republican who introduced the ban on federal funding of abortion, who I had always seen as this bad guy because of his opposition to abortion rights, that he actually supported welfare programs for poor people, because he thought if he was going to be making it so that more women were going to have babies, then he should be providing social support. I was really fascinated when I found Bob Packwood, the senator from Oregon, former senator from Oregon, who was this feminist and abortion rights champion, and yet was a serial sexual harasser of women. So I think in real life, and also in the best of the Miss Marple, you know, oeuvre, we see that the characters are complicated. And that feels true to me, right? And it also feels hopeful to me. Because, like, if we all are harboring that complexity within us, then we should be able to work through our difficulties and to get through this thing that we're all experiencing, this life and all of its struggles that we're all experiencing together. And so Whenever I start taking myself and others too seriously, I come back to that quote about how so many people are not either bad or good, but just very silly. Because I think that's kind of true.
It's such the ultimate Miss Marple quote, because it just takes the wind out of the sails of all of the self-seriousness, especially of the Raymond Wests of the world, who, is just eternally on a soapbox, right? And just thinks that everything he has to say is just super important. And I think there are a lot of politicians, perhaps, who, in some ways kind of inhabit that same sort of Raymond West-ish kind of posturing. And
totally.
That Miss Marple she wouldn't even roll her eyes at it. She doesn't need to. She doesn't need to do that. She'd still be very respectful, right? Like toward those people, and see the good in them, because that's what she does with her dear nephew. I mean, she actually has a ton of affection for him. She knows how silly he really is, but she's just she's that evolved that she can see beyond it and through it. And like, there's just this great moment in your book. It's such a tiny thing, but you taught and that's why I mentioned Paul Herring, because you two just don't. And I think at one point, after you've been talking to him for a while, you described the two of you as like two walls just staring at each other. And it's like, you just don't agree. Like you fundamentally don't agree as to what is happening in the procedure of abortion. I mean, for him, it's murder. For you, it's women's health. And yet there's this moment where you're talking and he is eating and like food drops or something he has like food on him.
The chicken sandwich.
Yes. And you're just like, you can't spend like a long time face to face with someone who has like a little bit of like chicken on them and think that they're evil, like because they're not, even though he is absolutely, like probably one of the biggest and talk about, this is someone I had literally never heard of, and I probably won't again, other than in your book, but a really important, one of those hidden sort of people where it's like, no, this is someone who actually contributed very significantly, even though you never hear his name. You usually only hear about a couple, a handful of people, right?
Right. And this was like where I loved the murder mystery frame so much, because it allowed me to put someone like Paul Herring front and center, to make him, the first chapter of my book. He's the ultimate like quiet housekeeper figure, right? He's like the behind the scenes suspect that you don't even notice until the final scene when the detective is like, it was that person. You're like, who? I didn't even notice that person, And I love it because I think that it's a radical statement, but very true, that like history is made by those people, right? It's not only made by the presidents or by the politicians that we hear about. It's made by the quiet folks, often the true believers, who are just working diligently behind the scenes. And that's true on all sides of a political topic, right? And so I really enjoyed finding people like that, this sort of the quiet suspects, the people you would least guess would be the culprit, and then trying to understand like what motivated them. Because it wasn't like they were trying to, win some, political office or make a ton of money, or, it was more subtle, it was more interesting, more complicated than that. And I probably spent more time with Paul Herring than anyone else, because his belief was so strong and he was so devoted to Catholicism, which is his religion. He spent so many hours trying to convert me. And I found that kind of touching in a way. I think he literally believed that he could save my soul from eternal damnation if he spent enough time with me. And I was spending time with him to try to get him to tell me all the stories he would tell me about the Hyde Amendment. So we had these different purposes.
Yeah.
And there was this sort of moment where like the Miss Marple approach kind of failed me, right? Where I realized like, right, this is not a murder mystery. This is like real life. And in real life, you don't get the like neat ending that you do in an Agatha Christie. And that was when I talked to Paul Herring about Rosie, right? And I was like, listen, you wrote a draft of the Hyde Amendment in 1974, 2 years before it passed. And immediately after it went into effect, this woman named Rosie died. And I told him about Rosie, and I watched his face for a reaction. And his reaction was like, well, you can't kill somebody because you want to get an education, right? Like he saw Rosie as the one who had done something wrong. And so it was like in real life, you don't get that kind of big payoff that you do, when Miss Marple unmasks the villain. And so there were some ways that this investigation felt like a murder mystery, especially when I could delve into the complexity of people's character and find these interesting, very human moments in my interactions with them. But there were also moments where it really failed to materialize the way that it does in a novel.
If the world were like a Sleep Number mattress, everything would adapt for your comfort. Because as your life changes and your body changes, Sleep Number mattresses adapt and shift to give you personalized comfort night after night. And now everything's on sale during our Memorial Day event. Save up to $1,200 on mattresses, plus free delivery when you add a base. Ends Monday. To experience a whole new world of comfort, visit a Sleep Number store or go to sleepnumber.com. Sleep Number, to a good life sleep.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely felt the parallel with Paul Herring as like one of the least likely suspects, right? Where you're like, this doesn't seem like someone who would have had the outsized impact that he actually did. But, as you investigate and uncover, he wrote this early version of what became the Hyde Amendment, and look at how, it's still in effect today. Like, look at how influential this was. I mean, in a weird way, this is such a strange analogy to make, but I know you'll understand it. It's almost like he's the quote unquote help.
Yes, exactly.
Right? The behind the scenes person who everyone, just sort of dismisses because he's not the big shiny politician or anything, but he did the work. And I mean, I'll be honest with you, one of my big takeaways from your book is that a major reason why I think the anti-abortion movement has been as successful as it has been since Roe versus Wade and through to the present day is that they have people like Paul Herring who are driving the movement, who have a religious faith at their core, like
Yes.
who are motivated by this just inexhaustible devotion to the cause, because it's coming from the heart. Like, it's coming from this place of this is my faith and this is how I believe the world is ordered. And my opinion is my opinion, but it's correct because my faith is what is driving it. And that sometimes on the other side, because there isn't that same sort of crystal clear motivating force, that maybe that is where the differential lies. And I don't know enough to really critique the pro-choice movement in that way. And you do a little bit of that in the book, but I'm curious. I'm asking you about it now. Do you think that's a fair criticism of what's motivating the pro-choice versus the anti-abortion movement? It's not even necessarily criticism, but that to me feels like something that might account for the overwhelming success of one side over another.
I think that's totally valid. I mean, I think there is a wishy-washiness on the pro-choice side as far as abortion that you can see in, for example, the 1990s Clinton era rhetoric of, abortion should be safe, legal, and rare. Or more recently when Planned Parenthood would emphasize, all of the services it offered that weren't abortion. There was this sort of equivocation that you didn't see on the anti-abortion side because they had this moral absolute stance on it. And yeah, I think the religious motivations, I mean, the anti-abortion movement has always understood that they have a higher number of people who will vote single issue against abortion. And I mean, if the pro-choice movement had an overwhelming number of people who voted single issue, given that we have majority support for abortion rights in this country, I think we would have seen a different outcome in the last election, right, in the wake of the Dobbs decision. And so I think that is a valid critique. I think like one of the things that surprised me in listening to some of these true believers, right, and I kind of classified the help, the quiet housekeeper types as the true believers, right? And they're really the driving force. They're who comes up with the ideas. They're who gets people to the polls. They're the driving force behind a lot of these politicians. And then the, folks like Henry Hyde who put their name on the legislation, they're the often political opportunists, the movers and shakers, the people who history remembers. But you need all of those folks, for a movement to succeed. I think one of the things that really surprised me in listening to true believers like Paul Herring is how much they were motivated not just by their faith when it came to what happened in this world, but they were very motivated by what they believe comes after. And Paul Herring's pitch to me when he was trying to convert me to Catholicism was the most important thing is we go to heaven. And it struck me that that is a sort of opportunity, right? Not a political opportunity, but a divine opportunity that the true believers in the anti-abortion and Christian conservative movement more broadly are being offered. And we don't really have an equivalent, right? On the progressive side of the aisle, it's sort of like,
Right.
well, we could have like equal justice for all, and we could have, everyone has what they need to survive, and we could have like everyone has healthcare, and like that's my version of heaven. I think that's pretty compelling, but it's not quite the same as saying you get to spend eternity in bliss with God. And so yeah, I think it's complicated, and that's why I wanted to really engage not just with the question of how this happened and who did it, but also why, right? Like I think my book is a why done it as much as it is a who done it.
Yes, no, absolutely. And I think it makes a lot of sense that Murder on the Orient Express, more than any other novel, I think is the one that you reference the most of Christie's. And don't worry, I'll provide a spoiler alert before the interview.
Thank goodness.
Yeah.
Christie would be so mad at me.
But
she hated when people spoiled the books.
They all did it, as most of us know by this point. And, that's the point you're making, that all of the people that you're accessing in this book and making contact with, to the extent that you can, not all these people are still alive, and not all of them necessarily wanted to speak with you, but that all of these people were responsible for the figurative and literal deaths that you're considering. So I'd also just love to ask, and this breaks free of the murder mystery mold as well, because at the end of a murder mystery, once the culprit has been revealed, that's kind of it. We know what happened, and like that is really what we've been after as readers. We just want that certainty. It's like that's really the drug that we all want to consume when we're reading a murder mystery, that we know everything that there is to know. We have absolute, almost godlike knowledge of everything that matters. But here, the point is to gain that knowledge as a means to the end of potentially using that, I would imagine, to try to further, your sort of pro-choice agenda, right? And I'm curious how you think one can do that. Basically, what I'm asking you is, where do you go from here, and where do others who feel similarly to you go from here? Now that you know what you know.
Yeah, thank you so much for noting that. I think it's true. And I hope this is a hopeful book, because I believe that work is already underway. And where I take the most solace is in finding the people, the quote unquote help, which is it's stuck in its time term, but we'll roll with it, because everyone who listens to this understands, right? The quiet housekeepers is
we're reclaiming it. We're reclaiming it. Yeah.
Help. We're all the help, right? Folks are working together. Folks are doing the work on the right side of history as well, right? The people like Paul Herring, the true believers, like they exist on the side of equality and justice as well. And they're out there and they're mobilizing, right? I think we saw that profoundly in Minneapolis, right? Where everyday citizens are out protecting their neighbors. And so I think in the same way that, finding these true believers on, the anti-abortion side kind of gave me a deeper understanding of how history happens. Like, I think we can apply those lessons to, the right side, the side that I would side with as well. And I also, I think Miss Marple's take on human nature, which is it's flawed, it can be wicked. It's also sometimes silly. We're all deeply flawed and deeply complicated. And I think there's something liberating about understanding that, and about not seeing the people on either side of this issue as either all bad or all good.
Mm-hmm.
Because if human beings got us to where we are today, then human beings can get us out, And so I hope that people emerge from this book with a sense of hope and a sense that, just as in Murder on the Orient Express, like it takes a team, it takes a strange mashup of people. It takes people from all walks of life, some quiet, some loud, some strong, some not strong, some who are going to make deep piercing wounds and some who are going to, just make little shallow ones. Like it takes a whole bunch of people working together. And that's true if you're rolling back a constitutional right. And it's true if you're trying to restore it and expand it as well.
I love that. I think it's definitely the case that I think if you read Miss Marple deeply and in a really considered way, you get a really good sense of that low anthropology, to borrow a phrase that I got from Dr. Sarah Hindley Wilson when we were covering some of those Star Over Bethlehem and Other Stories selections. And Miss Marple has a very clear-eyed view of humanity, but it's not necessarily a pessimistic one. That's the great thing. She realizes how flawed people are. Therefore, she actually has a lot of hope. And like that, I think if we can take that kind of contradiction and internalize it for ourselves when it comes to something like this, something as frustrating as this topic, like that is hugely helpful. And I just love it because it's like such an unexpected way of using, of taking a series of murder mysteries and applying it to our lives. So I have to ask you just one other question about Agatha Christie and abortion, because Agatha Christie, of course, did not make a habit of dealing directly with abortion and abortion rights in her stories. And yet, I recently had cause to consider the history of abortion rights in the UK. And this was with Dr. Sarah Hindley Wilson when we were covering the final short story in Star Over Bethlehem and Other Stories, the final one that we covered, which was The Water Bus. And that story contains a reference to an unsafe abortion, an abortion that results in a hospitalization for the woman who underwent the abortion. And in the story, I would say that Christie really affords a significant amount of grace to that young woman who suffers from the procedure. It's sort of an open question, I think, what Christie herself thought about the right to abortion as a political matter. But as I was reading your book, since you do name check Miss Marple and Agatha Christie as much as you do, I found myself wondering whether you ever considered the political stance of Agatha Christie and also of Miss Marple. I mean, I feel pretty strongly that Miss Marple actually would have been one of the true believers, a la Paul Herring. I don't think that Miss Marple was, ever going to be on the side of pro-choice here. But maybe that's not fair. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Christie and Miss Marple here, because I'm sure that this has crossed your mind.
I'm so glad you sent me that short story from Star Over Bethlehem, because I did try to research, as you noted, there's not that much out there about Agatha Christie and abortion. I mean, it would have been obviously banned during much of her lifetime in the UK. I did find one kind of funny reference to it in Mark Aldridge's book about Marple, where he's talking about Christie's feelings about the relationship between employer and servant and how they were influenced by her older relatives. And the quote from Agatha Christie is, "They worked their servants to the bone, but took a lot of care of them when they were ill. If a girl had a rather disorganized baby, Granny would go and speak to the young man. Well, are you going to do the right thing by Harriet?" So I guess that's a reference to unplanned pregnancy, not abortion. But like, I just love that euphemism, a rather disorganized baby. Because it just gives you this image of like someone has a baby and then the baby's like confused and disorganized, which like most babies are.
Absolutely.
But I think that's also just a reminder of like, she was alive during a particular time, right? When there were particular attitudes toward pregnancy and childbearing. But the story you shared with me, The Water Bus, I think it suggests to me a few things, right? It suggests to me that this was, I think it came out in 1965, right? So this would have been 2 years before the UK liberalized its abortion laws and before the UK became a place where women from the United States would travel if they had the money to do so. Because the law was more permissive in the UK before it changed in the United States with Roe v. Wade in 1973. And so it suggests to me that Christie would have been aware that women were dying as a result of restrictions on abortion, and that she had compassion for, the young women, and in this case for the mother who is, grieving and upset because her daughter has contracted an infection from an unsafe abortion. And so I think, like you, I saw a lot of compassion in that. And I think the overall message in that story is about the main character finding her way to what I read as an encounter with God, right, on this water taxi. And as a result of this encounter, she can feel other people's feelings. She can understand other people's motivations. And she emerges with this love for humanity. And I love that because I think as an atheist, right, the divine for me is the good in other people. And I think that's what a good novel does, right? It helps us to find the good in other people. It helps us to see other people as being as complicated as we are. And that's the sort of, attitude that I tried to bring to my research and to my reporting as well for this book.
Yeah. We know that there was a lot in the newspapers around the time that Christie would have been writing this story because of all of the legal maneuvering that was happening, which would result in a couple of years later, the liberalization of those laws. So definitely it's something that she was reading about a lot. And it's clear at the very least that she did not choose to condemn it. There's no way you can read The Water Bus and think this is someone who was virulently opposed to the very notion of this procedure and why, someone might feel that they needed this procedure and whatnot. So I just think that's important to keep in mind. People, I think, like to caricaturize Agatha Christie later in life as this old and crotchety, out of touch person who really just wasn't changing with the times. And when you read the texts from the 60s, including Star Over Bethlehem and other stories, it just couldn't be further from the truth. This is someone who, up until the very moment that she stopped writing, was absolutely in touch with what was going on around her because that's what she used. That's what she drew on to write. And it's really interesting that she even touches on abortion in this story. And, there are plenty of, I think, references. And, Miss Marple is always wondering, when one of her maids or her former maids comes to her and has a problem, it's pretty obvious that one of the first things she thinks it might be is that they're pregnant because she knows it happens. This is a reality, and it's not something that would have in any way shocked her. And I think the same can be said for Agatha Christie. So yeah, just really, really interesting. And again, that's not the way that you're using Agatha Christie as a model in your book. There's no sort of literal application, but I did just I was like, we can't finish this conversation without talking a little bit about The Water Bus. So yes, that's why I was like, I sent it to you ahead of time. I was like, I want to make sure you have this so that we can talk about this. So thank you for indulging me on that.
Yeah, I'm so glad you did. I loved reading it. And I think you're so right about Christie. And there are ways in which she's stuck in her time. And I do not turn to her for my feminist politics in this moment. Right. And yet, I think she does deserve credit. And I think you're right that there is a real compassion that shines through in that story. Miss Marple is probably a different story. I don't know.
She's a big fan of capital punishment. We know that.
We know she loves capital punishment. But we also know that she is someone who is very compassionate towards women, very compassionate towards people in need, and a good listener. And so maybe there's hope. And certainly, there are lots of people of faith out there who support reproductive health care and rights. And so I would hate to make an assumption about her that's not true.
You know what? We never want to make assumptions in Christie. So you're absolutely right.
Nope. Not about Dear Aunt Jane.
Nope. I think that's a great point.
If the world were like a Sleep Number mattress, everything would adapt for your comfort. Because as your life changes and your body changes, Sleep Number mattresses adapt and shift to give you personalized comfort night after night. And now everything's on sale during our Memorial Day event. Save up to $1,200 on mattresses, plus free delivery when you add a base. Ends Monday. To experience a whole new world of comfort, visit a Sleep Number store or go to sleepnumber.com. Sleep Number, to a good night's sleep.
We've been talking about, quote unquote, Miss Marple this entire interview, but I want to talk about who you see when you reference Miss Marple, because I believe, based on something that you said when we were emailing, that your favorite Miss Marple on the screen might not be my favorite Miss Marple on the screen.
Kemper, is this where I'm going to get canceled by listeners of this show? It's not the abortion talk. It's the fact that my Marple is Geraldine McEwen.
Please explain. And I mean, Geraldine McEwen does not get enough airtime on this podcast in a positive way. And there are so many people out there who adore Geraldine McEwen's turn as Miss Marple. So please tell me, and I promise I do not mean this in a snarky way, tell me why she is your favorite of the Miss Marple.
And you're going to be a Miss Marple style listener. You're going to just...
Exactly, yes.
Did you or did you not have a listener who wrote in to say she had watched The Body in the Library starring Geraldine McEwen as Miss Marple while she was in labor? This happened, right? I'm pretty sure.
Did that happen? Maybe. I'm going to take your word for it.
I think about her at least once a month and I need her to call me so we can be friends. I think it's true. Because I was like, is that me? Did I write that note? But I didn't actually watch it while I was in labor, but I should have. Okay, so Kemper, last night before coming on this podcast, I made myself a cocoa because I am Miss Marple in so many ways and sat down to rewatch the Marple series starring Geraldine McEwen so I could really give you my analysis of just why I love her so much. She is mischievous. That's what I like about her. She is a little tongue-in-cheek. She's a little irreverent. You know, she's smart and she's sparkling and she just walks around with the sense that she's being underestimated and that she's fine with that because she's smarter than everyone thinks she is and she's smarter than everyone around her. And I have felt that way as a woman where I'm just sort of walking around like kind of inwardly smiling because I know people like aren't noticing me or they're noticing me and disregarding me. You know, I feel that way often when I'm doing my work in some of these conservative spaces. And so I feel like she's just kind. Like she is not dark Marple. She is lighthearted Marple. Okay. She is like the Miss Marple who thinks people are silly and not wicked, that they're not good or bad. They're very silly. And but the real honest answer, Kemper, is that is the version of Miss Marple that was there for me when I needed her. When I was reporting this book shortly after the 2024 election, I had a miscarriage and I was really devastated. It was a wanted pregnancy. And I was reporting this book about reproductive rights and about people's bodily autonomy being intruded on. And I would just spend hours on the couch watching and rewatching Miss Marple starring Geraldine McEwen. And I was so soothed by it. I knew that in these movies, unlike in real life, everything was going to be set right in the end. The killer was going to be caught. The killer was going to face consequences. And that was so not true in the political landscape that was unfolding all around us. And so she was there for me, as I think she was there for so many listeners in times of need when we need that comfort and we need to escape into one of these stories. And so she is the one who lives in my heart forever.
Wow. Well, first of all, I'm so sorry for the loss and that experience. It's, which I just want to say, because I know that people, there's an awkwardness around that, the language of miscarriage. And I appreciate that you even shared that. It makes sense that is the version of Miss Marple that you would want to turn to, actually, in a moment like that. As you said, she has all of the intelligence that the Joan Hickson Miss Marple, say, has, but it hasn't tarnished her in any way. Like, she's just every bit as whimsical and lighthearted, as if none of that bothered her. Like, it's almost like the fantasy, right? It's like, I've got all the intelligence, but I've got all the upside of the intelligence, but none of the downside. And I think that fantasy sometimes rubs some people the wrong way, because they're like, well, that just doesn't even seem real. It doesn't seem like a real character. I prefer my grounded Joan Hickson Miss Marple. But I can easily see why the fantasy of that is for some people the draw. I never thought about it that way. So I knew you did not disappoint me. And I knew that you were going to give me a new perspective on Geraldine McEwen as Miss Marple. So thank you seriously for doing that, because she really is beloved. And it's so different too from, I think it's sometimes a little unfair in that she was replaced by Julia McKenzie in the same overall program. So the two almost get sort of conflated, because Julia McKenzie was not doing that. Julia McKenzie was almost doing something like Joan Hickson light, kind of.
Yes.
There's something to be said for her as well. I don't want to, I don't want to pile on poor Julia McKenzie's performance, but it's different. It's very different. And I think the conflation, sometimes Geraldine McEwen can get lost inside of that and what she was doing, the very specific thing that she was doing with her performance. So
yeah, totally. And I mean, there's liberties that production takes that drive me nuts, right? Like the whole like lost love plot, and like the unforgivable fact that The Body in the Library doesn't start with Dolly Bantry saying, "Arthur, wake up, there's a body in the library." Like, come on, how do you skip over that? Like, that's the perfect opening scene. So yeah, there's problems with the production, but to me, she is perfect. And thank you for being such a good listener when I talked about her, even though you disagree.
Exactly. Yeah. I guess you could say we're two walls staring at each other, but the walls have major cracks in them, and I can see you. I can see you through the cracks in my wall, and I think you can see me. Yeah.
We're just two flawed human beings, Kemper, looking at each other through the wall.
Oh my God. Well, I so appreciate all the time that you have given us on this very unusual, but I think extremely illuminating and important episode of All About Agatha. But I'm going to end it the way I do all of my interviews. I think I know the answer to this age-old question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Poirot or Marple?
Oh my gosh, Kemper. Of course it's Marple.
Oh, thank God. If you should have just said Poirot, just to punk me.
Can you imagine, though, if this book had been like, I'm investigating the death of abortion rights by like straightening the vases on people's mantelpieces, or like, gee, I like have this tendency to perfectionism, which I do. I mean, that's valid. So I'm rearranging my like interview subjects' furniture and like straightening their ties, and like that would just have been a very different book. So no, it was Miss Marple, the listener, the subversive listener, all the way.
That's so fantastic. Well, Amy, thank you so much. And I am providing a link to your book in the show notes for this episode for all those who are curious if they haven't already been made aware of your book. And I just really appreciate what you did, and also your willingness to come on and speak about this. And I also just have to ask, what is next for you?
Oh, thank you so much, Kemper. This was so much fun. I have to say, I've been disappointed by how little Marple and Agatha Christie content there's been. For some reason, people want to talk about like politics in all of my interviews for this book. So this was such a pleasure. I am working now on some reporting about conservative women. I'm really interested in women in the conservative movement right now. And so that's kind of what I'm thinking about for my next book project. I'm not sure if there's going to be an Agatha Christie parallel for that one, but I'm keeping an open mind, which I think Miss Marple would approve of.
Sounds like you have a lot more subversive listening in your future.
That's right. Subversive deep listening all the way.
All right. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you, Kemper.
Thank you again to Amy Littlefield, author of Killers of Roe, My Investigation into the Mysterious Death of Abortion Rights, and big ol' Miss Marple and Agatha Christie fan. I really appreciated her joining me and having an unusual discussion for the All About Agatha podcast. My next episode is going to be much more traditional. I will be covering The Edge by Agatha Christie, which is one of the scant few Agatha Christie short stories that we have not yet covered on this podcast, so we have new material to discuss next time. And speaking of, if you are looking for more content from this podcast, you can always head on over to the podcast's Patreon page. There is a link in the show notes. For June's episode, I will be discussing 2 additional original Agatha Christie short stories that I have never discussed here on the podcast: The House of Dreams and The Lonely God. So I have a lot of original Agatha Christie material in my future, which makes me very happy. If you would like to see me in person at the Agatha Christie Festival in September, I believe that there are a few tickets left to my balloon debate panel crowning Agatha Christie's greatest narrator. I also believe there are tickets left for that Saturday game show night that we'll be doing. Lots of fun to be had in September in Torquay. I've included links to that as well in the show notes. You can always email me, of course, at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. You can find the podcast on Instagram at allaboutagatha. You can find me at my author website, www.kemperdonovan.com. I've linked to all this as well. I have also linked to the news and events page on my website because I do have some upcoming bookstore events timed with the release of my third Ghostwriter Mysteries Sweet Spot. You can still pre-order Sweet Spot. You can come and meet me at various locations in the United States. So please do look into that if you are at all interested. And please also take a moment to rate, to review this podcast so that others can find it. And I'll see you next time. Bye.
If the world were like a Sleep Number mattress, everything would adapt for your comfort. Because as your life changes and your body changes, Sleep Number mattresses adapt and shift to give you personalized comfort night after night. And now everything's on sale during our Memorial Day event. Save up to $1,200 on mattresses, plus free delivery when you add a base. Ends Monday. To experience a whole new world of comfort, visit a Sleep Number store or go to sleepnumber.com. Sleep Number, to a good night's sleep.
If you like the show, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe. It really does help the show to grow. Thank you for listening.